Welcome to this online Bible study on Galatians chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. And in these first 5 verses, we're going to look at a question. Are you, as a Christian, living a religiously unchristian life? Now, the key term here is religiously. We know that we can live as not as a Christian by being worldly. We can be worldly and not be living a Christian life. But we're talking about as a Christian, as a believer in Christ, are you living a religiously unchristian life? Is your spiritual life betraying your Christian beliefs? Now, these 5 verses down here are going to help us to discover that. So let's go ahead and dive in. Verse 1, you foolish Galatians. Now, Paul's term there, foolish, is rather strong. Another way of saying this would be idiotic or stupid. And there are English translations of this word that actually use idiotic and stupid. So it's like saying, you dear idiots, why are you so idiotic? In other words, he doesn't mean this in a mean way. He's just saying you're missing the point. You're lacking your knowledge. You're being crazy. You're being stupid. You're being idiotic. You foolish Galatians. Who has bewitched you? Bewitched word is another word here that's, who has cast a spell? Who has put you under a trance? Who has cast a spell on you and to lead you astray? Now, essentially here, it's almost a sorcery term. Who has cast a spell? Who has led you astray to the Galatians here? Now, the reason why is because of this. Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. Now, we're going to come back to was crucified in just a moment. So what's the problem here in Galatians that Paul actually wants to address? The problem is this. The Galatians have accepted and taken a new position. The Galatians' new position is how they're living. They are living a religiously different life than how they started their life of faith. And essentially, their position is doing what? It is contradicting the gospel. And as we saw in the first 2 chapters, Paul takes any contradiction to the gospel very seriously. So that's the problem here. He's accusing them of being idiotic, stupid, and foolish because, and being cast under a spell or under sorcery because these Judaizers, these people, have caused them to adopt this new position that actually contradicts the gospel. They have moved from accepting Christ by grace to works, as we're going to see as we move on. And we go on in verse 1 here. Let's go back to this. Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. Portrayed, first let's go with what was crucified. He was crucified here at the end of verse 1. And essentially the word here that was used was a word in Greek that is ostromanos. In other words, this word right here essentially means that Christ's work is done. Christ was crucified. It's a strong term. And essentially, it's not a general instruction about Jesus, but a specific proclamation here at the end of verse 1. And the force of this perfect tense of the participle of the word used here, ostronomos, this word, that Christ's work was completed on the cross, and that the benefits of his crucifixion are forever. So this word means that it was, Christ was crucified, his work equals done. There is nothing more that needs to be done because of the word used here. Christ's work is done. Salvation is done. The life of faith has been done for us. And essentially, the benefits of Christ being crucified on the cross, the word used here, the benefits of that lead to forever. In other words, nothing else needs to be done. There is no work. There's nothing that needs to be added to the cross. The cross was sufficient. Christ was crucified. His work is done. The benefits last forever. And that's the significance here of Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. And now let's talk about this word portrayed here. The word portrayed, used here at the end of verse 1, portrayed equals a billboard. It's a banner. In other words, Paul's not saying that they had no idea about Christ being crucified. Paul is saying something very strong here. He is saying that they knew the gospel. It was held up in front of them. It was a banner that they saw every day. It was a big old huge poster advertising it. It was a billboard. They knew about it. They saw the image. They knew the reality of Christ crucified. And so that's what we learn here in verse 1 already, that the Galatians have adopted this new position that creates a problem because their lives are contradicting the gospel, contradicting that Christ's work was actually done and that the benefits are forever. Their lives are contradicting that because of how they're living. So then we're going to move on to verse 2. And in verse 2, we're going to see Paul raise some questions here to the Galatians. So what kind of questions is Paul going to raise here in verses 2 through 5? Well, the first question we see in verse 2. And the first question is, let's look at the verse. I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive being emphasized here, did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by believing? So in verse 2, we're going to see that Paul's question is, did you receive the Spirit, in other words, the presence of God in your life, did you receive the Spirit by works or by faith? Was it works or faith? You got two options here. Did you receive it by works or did you receive it by faith? And the obvious answer is they received it by believing what they heard. They heard the gospel. It was portrayed before them. It was the banner. It was a billboard. They heard it. They believed it. So there's the first question Paul has to them, to ask them about their experience. The second question he's going to ask them and argue to them about their experience is, are you so foolish? In other words, are you so idiotic or stupid that you forgot that? Because after beginning by means of the Spirit, they began by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh? A contradiction. So the question here is, how does the Christian life continue? How does the Christian life continue? You know, and this is a question that many of us practically run into in our daily existence all the time, because we put our faith in Christ. We believed in Him, just like the Galatians here. We believed in Him. We believed what we heard. We began the Christian life. We begin by means of the Spirit. In other words, we receive the gospel. We receive Christ into our lives. But then we try to continue in the Christian life, and we try to finish the Christian life by means of the flesh. And then flesh meaning works, by following traditions, by doing certain things, by trying to be good enough. So how does the Christian life continue? Well, it's not by the works of the flesh. No, it began by the Spirit. It continues by the work of God in our lives. It began by grace, it continues by grace. So what's the third question? As we move on to verse 4, we're going to see another question that Paul has. Have you experienced so much in vain? He's directly talking about their experience in vain. Has it become meaningless? Are you trying to make it worth as though it was nothing? Have you experienced so much in vain if it really was in vain? So what's all that really mean? What's he trying to get at in verse 4? Well, essentially in verse 4, we see the third question. Does the grace that saved you, does the grace that saved you mean anything to you? Does it mean anything to you? We're going to add something else to it. Does the grace that saved you mean anything to you now? Again, the word being used here is that it should mean something to us now. In other words, we began the Christian life by grace. It should mean something to us now. In other words, we don't put our faith is not something we do in the past. Faith is something we live in God's presence right now. We began by grace through faith. We continue by grace through faith. So what does it mean now? If it doesn't mean, if our faith is vain, meaning it was only something that happened X amount of years ago, and now we try to live for God and try to please Him by what we do, as though we're earning our salvation and earning our growth and our spiritual sanctification, then we are essentially saying that all that faith stuff was vain. The sacrifice of Christ wasn't good enough for us. We can't experience its benefits forever. There's something else that we need to do. And essentially that's the very idea and the very concept and problem that Paul's addressing here, is that the Christian life began by grace, and right now the cross and the grace should mean something to us, not just way back when, but right now in our daily living. And then as we move to verse 5, in verse 5, so again I ask, Does God give you his Spirit and work miracles? In other words, he gave us his Spirit. Does he do that and work miracles among you? In other words, talking about God's work here. Does God do all of his work in our lives because of the law or by believing, by faith in what you heard? So the fourth question that Paul's going to ask here and that we can talk about is, how does God work in your life? And the world around you. Does God work in the world around us because of things that we do, because we're good enough, because we're a good enough witness, because we're a good enough evangelist, because we're a good enough teacher? No way, Paul is saying here. God works in your life and in the world around you according to his Spirit. It's not because it's not because of the works of the law. It's not because of this stuff. It's not because of what we do. It's not the works of the law in verse 5 that it's, we don't do things and then God does them because we do them. No, it's quite the opposite. God is working in our world, and he calls us to be a part. He calls us to do certain things. So how does God work in your life and the world around you? He does his work in this world by his Spirit and by his grace, and because he's doing something, not because we're good enough and not because we're following laws, but because God is up to something in this world. So there are four questions, and here are four questions that we can look at and see if we're living as we ought to be as Christians. But now let's go back to our original question. What was our original question? The original question was, are you, as a Christian, living a religiously non-Christian life? Now, here's the reality of this text, and here's what it would teach us. That if we're living by works, essentially, are you as a Christian living a religiously unchristian life? If you're trying to be good enough for God, if you're living in a way to where you're trying to do things for God and to where you're trying to earn your salvation, if you're living by works, trying to follow the right traditions or trying to follow some magical formula or trying to do the right things to such an extent that you're trusting in yourself, if you're living by works, then yes, you are living a religiously unchristian life. However, if you are trusting in God's grace, if you are believing that God's work in Christ is sufficient for you, not only to begin the Christian life, but to continue and finish the Christian life, then no. If you are living by trusting and having faith in Jesus Christ and his grace and God's grace to you, then you are not living a religiously unchristian life. No, you are living the Christian life as it's meant to be lived, and Christ is active and alive in you. So if works, yes, you're living a religiously unchristian life. But if by grace, no, you are living a faithful, religious Christian life.